it seems such a kind of metaphor for the overall fate of the country. People get invaded, they're making desperate choices to try and escape. And at the end of the day, this couple, they've been married for over 3 decades. One gets mortally, well, one's killed, then the other kneels beside their body, and Valery doesn't leave his wife, and eventually he's killed kneeling beside her.
Anthony, let's just tell me a little bit about what the people of Ukraine are going through, and you've written about this through the lens of a couple, a Ukrainian couple, who in so many ways illustrate the suffering and the danger faced by Ukrainians every day.
So, John, this is a story about a married couple. They've been married for over 30 years. They've been teenage sweethearts living in a village. And it's really the story about what happens when normal people have their lives subsumed by war, which is the experience of most Ukrainians now. So the woman's name was Valentina. Her husband was Valery. They were respectively 52 and 54 years old. They were living in a village called Hrabovska, which is in north of Ukraine, just north of Sumy Oblast, Sumy region. And it's abuts the border with Russia. In December last year, just gone by, ahead of Christmas, on December the 19th, a force of about 100 Russian soldiers managed to infiltrate across the border into Ukraine and capture the village. Inside the village, they rounded up, there are about 52 civilians left. The Russians rounded them up and took them over the border back to Russia. The village and the area around it then became the scene of heavy fighting. But not all the civilians had been rounded up. Valentina and her husband Valery had escaped. They'd remained in a cellar, and they carried on living there, hoping for the chance either to escape or be freed by Ukrainian troops, until the 27th of January, just over 8 days ago, when, driven by hunger and by cold, they were forced out of their cellar at the start of this audacious escape across no man's land. No man's land was about 7 kilometers, between 5 and 7 kilometers in that area, and they hoped somehow to be able to cross the snows along frozen lanes and reach Ukrainian lines. Now, ultimately, that plan didn't work out, but it was still a desperate plan in which, if nothing else, they stuck by each other to the bitter end.
Yes, we can only imagine how awful it must have been trying to take cover, refuge, and hide in that basement in those temperatures with no supplies. Anthony, just tell me, why did the Russian soldiers round up the villagers in the way that they did and transport them to Russia? What was the point of that?
Well, there's a number of ways of looking at that. Some people would say, well, they rounded up the civilians to remove them from an area of active hostilities. I mean, once the Russians got into the village, then the edge of the village became the scene of fighting, and a new front line opened up around there. Another way of looking at it is to say that, well, the Russians have consistently, and they've taken land, often taken Ukrainian civilians and Ukrainian children back into Russia to Russify them. Certainly, Ukraine's foreign minister accused the Russians of kind of hostage terrorist policy in the case of this village. It was a very small village, but it gained great prominence in Ukraine. There was fury over it. Zelensky criticized it. The foreign minister brought it up. It's an international incident, and accused the Russians of terrorism and hostage taking. So the story's gained quite a lot of prominence here. That was at the start of it. But when that story had gained its prominence, Valentina and Valery were still alive. As I said, it was only a few days ago that they were killed while trying to escape. I talked you through their escape. And their bodies, may I add, are still lying where they fell, out in no man's land. No one can collect them.
Yeah, and just picking up the story of Valery and Valentina, after they made their break looking for safety, after being holed up in that basement for so very long, they went through a period, which again is difficult to imagine, of being, I don't know, in fear of Russian drones and being sought by drones from their own side at the same time.
So the two things happened. No sooner had they escaped, it was daytime, about 11 o'clock in the morning of the 27th of January, a Russian FPV drone, kamikaze drone, targeted them, blew up close to Valentina, wounding her. We know what happened because we've seen on drone footage. Valery managed to get a sledge out of an outhouse. He puts his wife on it. So she's conscious and sitting up. He then starts towing her across no man's land. Not long after that, he pauses to catch his breath, and another Russian FPV kamikaze drone slams straight into the sledge and kills Valentina. Valery then appears, he kneels, he appears to be weeping beside the body of his wife, and he's there for some time. But just prior to this, some Ukrainian observation drones. Remember now, this is increasingly a battlefield dominated by drones. The Ukrainian drones are up as well. They've seen two civilians trying to escape. They clearly understand they're Ukrainians and civilians. They radio back to their base saying, look, two of our own are trying to escape the village. And an improvised rescue, a hasty rescue attempt is put together with a special police rescue unit. They gather at a rendezvous point about 6 kilometers away. They get one of their own drones to drop up a radio beside Valery. He picks it up and he's directed towards the rendezvous point. But at that point, they then start getting hit by Russian drones. And finally, nearly 5 hours after their escape attempt began, by which time Valentina's dead in the sledge. She's been killed by a kamikaze drone. Valery's kneeling beside her, weeping. He is then killed by an FPV drone as well. The escape, the rescue attempt is obviously annulled. There's nothing can be done. And their bodies still, even now, as I speak to you, lie in the snows outside Hrabovska because no one can get them. It's too dangerous. They'll get hit by drones.
Anthony, tell me, how did you come to see the footage of this drone attack on this poor couple? Was it posted online by the Russians?
No, so first of all, the story grew around this village and what had happened to it. I was very interested in that. No sooner I actually arrived in Ukraine at the start of an assignment than Valentina and Valery were killed trying to escape the village. And the story of these two people, it wasn't really known quite who they were at the beginning, then their names were known. And it seems such a kind of metaphor for the overall fate of the country. People get invaded, they're making desperate choices to try and escape. And at the end of the day, this couple, they've been married for over 3 decades. One gets mortally, one's killed, then the other kneels beside their body, and Valery doesn't leave his wife, and eventually he's killed kneeling beside her. It just seemed a kind of metaphor for the experience of the country. Yes, I have seen the footage. I haven't seen the Russian kill footage. I've seen the Ukrainian drone footage, which shows them leaving, then Valery kneeling beside his dead wife, and then him dead beside his wife too. And I've spoken to Ukrainians who saw the full footage of it in real time as it happened, and spoken to those who are involved in the rescue party who are going to try and rescue them.
And will this have been, maybe we can't be sure about this, but will this have been one of the attacks that I've seen accounts of the Russians seeing that their target is a helpless civilian, in this case 2 civilians, and carrying out the attack anyway? I've seen that described as almost a kind of sport as well as a propaganda exercise. Can you throw any light on that?
Well, I've seen the footage of their escape attempts, so I can tell you absolutely that the 2 people in that footage you can see are a middle-aged couple and a wounded woman being pulled on a sledge by a guy who's struggling in the snow. I mean, there's no doubt about it. They're civilians. There's different ways of looking at it, and also it does work in different ways in this war. You could say that the killers were psychopaths indulging in some kind of sport, which certainly happens in some parts of Ukraine, or you can say that in the Russian way, and this does happen in the Russian way of war, a commander would have said to his troops, eliminate anything that moves in that area, and Russian soldiers would have obeyed that and killed anything that did move in that area, regardless of whether they were man, woman or child. That's the way the Russians work.
What an awful story. Anthony, thanks so much for bringing it to us. And it can be read there in the Times now. Anthony Loyd there, a special correspondent for the Times in Ukraine.